Darren Sharper went from Super Bowl champion to convicted serial rapist, and some NFL legends who once knew and respected him have had some brutal things to say. From former teammates to players across the league, their reactions show just how far Sharper has fallen. Let's get into it. Leroy Butler played alongside Sharper in Green Bay. He wasn't some casual teammate. He considered Sharper one of his closest friends in the league. So when the accusations broke, Butler didn't hedge. He described Sharper as a man who acted like he was straight out of a chivalry story. The type of guy who was like the chivalry days where you'd lay down a jacket so they could walk over the puddle. Butler said Sharper was always respectful, that his own kids liked him, that his 4 daughters thought highly of the man. That's the version of Sharper his own teammate carried around for years. And that's exactly why Butler's shock landed so hard. Once the truth came out, Antonio Freeman, another Packers legend who lined up next to Sharper on Sundays, didn't sugarcoat what it meant if the allegations were true. He told the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel flatly that if their story is true and it's proven, it's a sad, sad day. That's a Super Bowl-era Packer, a man who built his name, in the same locker room, having to publicly confront the idea that his friend was a predator. Troy Williams, who also played with Sharper in Green Bay, went further. He said he never could have imagined seeing what allegedly happened with Sharper, that he never saw it coming, calling it mind-boggling. But Williams didn't stop at shock. He put it in historical terms, saying that either way, it was going to go down as one of the worst things in NFL history. He couldn't think of anything to that magnitude. Then there's Scott Fujita, who played with Sharper on that Super Bowl-winning New Orleans Saints team, the same championship run that made Sharper a legend in that city. Fujita didn't try to defend his former teammate at all. He told Bleacher Report he was disgusted by what he's accused of and said he'd leave it at that for now. That's not a guy standing up for a friend. That's a guy stepping back from him entirely. Scott Shanlow, a Saints linebacker who'd shared a locker room with Sharper, tried to give him the benefit of the doubt at first, innocent until proven guilty, he said. But even Shanley admitted the accumulating reports kept making things look worse. He told the Times-Picayune that the more things that kept popping up, the worse it looks. So right there, you've got 4 different men who wore an NFL uniform next to Darren Sharper. Butler, Freeman, Williams, Fujita, plus Shanley watching the walls close in, and every single one of them ended up somewhere between disgusted and devastated. Not one of them defended him once the pattern became undeniable. But teammates weren't the only NFL figures who had to publicly reckon with Sharper. Once he pleaded guilty and the case moved toward sentencing, it wasn't just locker room friends weighing in. It was the people who decide who gets immortalized in Canton, Ohio. The ones who vote for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Jason Cole, an NFL writer who also happened to be one of the actual Hall of Fame selectors, said he would feel disgusting if he ever cast a vote for Sharper. He put it plainly, off the field is not supposed to count, but I would feel disgusting if I voted for him. There's a certain point where you can't separate the two, and he crossed that line. That's a man whose literal job is to evaluate football greatness, saying the crimes were too heavy to separate from the resume. Sal Paolantonio, an ESPN correspondent and fellow Hall of Fame voter, tried to stay diplomatic about the process, but even he made it clear where his head was at when it came to actual candidates worth honoring. He said he was respectful of the selection process and wouldn't pass judgment until the annual meeting if Sharper ever became a finalist, but that safeties like John Lynch and Brian Dawkins deserved consideration before Sharper. Translation: even in diplomatic language, Sharper wasn't who Paolantonio wanted representing that position, and sports columnist Mike DeCourcy, writing about the nomination, drew a line that a lot of football people quietly agreed with. He said this wasn't a case of a guy who was difficult with the media or got into one too many scuffles. He wrote that this is not a character flaw. This is something even Sharper described at his own sentencing as heinous. This is not someone who was mean to reporters or undermined his teammates or got in one too many bar fights. This is someone who has acknowledged he drugged women, notice the plural, for the purpose of forcing himself on them while they were incapacitated. That's the tone that surrounded Darren Sharper by the time his name kept surfacing in football circles. Not admiration, not nostalgia for the interceptions and the Super Bowl ring, but disgust from the very people who once called him a peer. To understand how a 5-time Pro Bowler turned into a man that his own teammates couldn't defend, you have to go back to where it all started. The career that made him untouchable, and the pattern that started forming the moment the cameras turned off. Before any of this, Darren Sharper was one of the best defensive backs of his generation. He came out of William and Mary, got picked up by the Green Bay Packers, and spent 14 seasons in the league, bouncing from Green Bay to Minnesota and finally to New Orleans. He racked up 6 All-Pro selections and 5 Pro Bowl nods. He intercepted passes at a rate that put him among the best ball-hawking safeties to ever play the position, finishing his career with over 1,400 interception return yards. He played in 2 Super Bowls, one as a rookie with the Packers, and one that mattered most, the one where he helped the Saints win it all after the 2009 season. That championship made him a hero in New Orleans. Specifically, this wasn't some journeyman passing through. This was a guy the city put a banner up for. He was by most accounts inside the building, the second best free agent signing the Saints franchise ever made. People wrote his name next to legends of that franchise. He retired in 2011 and didn't disappear. He moved straight into television, working as an NFL Network analyst. He was in front of cameras every week. He was the guy breaking down safety rotations and coverage schemes for a national audience. That's the image most football fans had of him. During the years, the truth was actually catching up to him behind the scenes. Because while he was on TV talking about the game, women in multiple states were describing a disturbingly similar experience with him. Nights out that ended in blackouts, waking up confused, realizing they'd been assaulted. According to reporting later done in partnership with ProPublica and Louisiana's Advocate newspaper, one of the earliest documented cases traced back to a September morning, when a woman called police from a hospital saying she'd been raped. She told detectives a story that would become horrifyingly familiar. She'd gone out, had a lot to drink, met a man, gone to his place, and woken up with him on top of her. That case wasn't random. The accuser was a former cheerleader for the Saints, and the man she named was Sharper, a hero of the Saints' 2009 Super Bowl team, a former Pro Bowl player, and a broadcast analyst for the league's television network. Detectives working that case pulled DNA. It matched. Witnesses placed Sharper with the intoxicated woman at a club and later at his condo. And investigators later found something chilling in the broader pattern. Sharper typically chose victims who were white women in their early 20s. Records show this wasn't impulsive. This was a method repeated across different cities, different states, different women who had never met each other and had no reason to compare notes until police started connecting the cases. It wasn't the first red flag either. Years earlier in Miami Beach, a woman had accused him of assault, but that investigation went nowhere fast. Records later showed the detective assigned to the case never sent the rape kit out for detailed examination, never spoke to Sharper directly, and never even visited the condo where the woman said the assault happened. The case was closed within days. That failure would matter a lot later, because it meant Sharper kept operating with no consequences for years while more women were targeted. Then came a pre-Super Bowl party in New Orleans in early 2013, where a woman working as a model was allegedly helped into a vulnerable state so she could be assaulted by a friend of Sharper's, a man named Brandon Licciardi, a sheriff's deputy in a parish neighboring New Orleans. That name, Licciardi, would end up tied to Sharper's case for years afterward, first as an alleged accomplice, then as a co-defendant, then as a convicted rapist himself. By early the following year, police in multiple states had started comparing notes, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Sharper was formally charged with 2 counts of rape by use of drugs, plus 5 related felony counts. He was released on bond, but as more allegations surfaced in other states, that bond number kept climbing, first raised to $1 million. Then prosecutors in California pushed to have it raised again, this time asking for $10 million, citing the fact that he was facing similar investigations everywhere he went. He pleaded not guilty at first. That posture wouldn't last, because the deeper investigators dug, the more they found. What started as an isolated report from one city turned into parallel investigations. In Louisiana, California, Arizona, and Nevada, each one describing the same method, the same drugs, the same pattern of a man using his charm and his fame to get women alone, then drugging their drinks so they couldn't fight back or even remember what happened to them. That method, and the number of women affected by it, is where the story gets genuinely disturbing, and it's where we have to go next. Here's what investigators eventually laid out in Sharper's own signed words. As part of his plea agreement, Sharper signed a 15-page statement admitting exactly how it worked. He or his friend, Brandon Licciardi, a former sheriff's deputy, would put anti-anxiety drugs or sedatives into women's drinks so they could rape them. That's not an allegation anymore at that point. That's Sharper's own signature on a document describing what he did. The specific drugs named in his case: read like a checklist of substances meant to strip away a person's ability to resist or even remember. Ambien, Xanax, Valium, and ecstasy. He'd get women into a hotel room, sometimes with a friend, sometimes alone, hand them a drink laced with one of those, and then the women would describe waking up hours later with no memory of what happened. Only physical evidence and a gut feeling that something had been done to them while they were unconscious. The Los Angeles case, one of the ones that first brought him into custody, involved two women he met at a West Hollywood nightclub. He invited them to what he framed as a party, but instead of taking them there, the LA charges come from two separate sexual assaults. The first when he invited two women from a West Hollywood nightclub to a party, but instead first stopped at his hotel room with the women and gave each one a drink with the sedative Zolpidem. One woman said she woke up naked hours later, while Sharper was sexually assaulting her, and the other woman woke up and interrupted his actions, according to prosecutors. That's not one bad night. That's a pattern that repeated itself across cities that had no connection to each other, which is exactly why it took so long for anyone to piece it together. Women in New Orleans had no way of knowing women in Arizona or Nevada were living through the exact same nightmare with the exact same man. Once prosecutors in all 4 states started comparing files, the number of women affected kept climbing, and it climbed fast. What started as isolated police reports in individual cities turned into charges around the country involving 9 victims, but the judge overseeing the federal case said in court that there may be as many as 16 women in 4 different states, all describing some version of the same experience: a night out, a drink that hit different than it should have, and then waking up violated. Sharper wasn't operating entirely alone either. 2 other men ended up charged alongside him for their roles in the scheme. Licciardi and Nunez both admitted distributing drugs with the intent to commit rape. Licciardi, the former deputy, ended up admitting to helping drug women alongside Sharper and admitted to raping a woman that Sharper himself had drugged. Eric Nunez, the other co-defendant, was tied into the same conspiracy in New Orleans. For a long stretch of the legal process, it looked like Sharper might walk away, with a shockingly light sentence given the scale of what he'd done. Prosecutors initially floated a multi-jurisdictional plea deal that would have had him serving somewhere around 9 years combined across all 4 states. An Arizona judge had sentenced him to 9 years and what both the prosecutor and defense attorney said amounted to lifetime probation. To a lot of people following the case, especially the survivors, who'd waited years for any resolution. 9 years for what amounted to a multi-state, multi-year pattern of drugging and raping women felt like an insult. That's when the federal judge overseeing the New Orleans piece of the case stepped in and blew the deal up. U.S. District Judge Jane Trish Milazzo looked at the proposed 9-year deal and rejected it outright, calling it too lenient. That decision set up the sentencing hearing that would define how the public finally understood the scale of what Sharper had done. And it's where his own teammates' disgust started to look mild, compared to what was coming from the people he'd actually hurt. When Sharper finally stood in front of Judge Milazzo for his federal sentencing, the number 9 years was gone. She threw out the lighter deal and handed him 18 years in prison, 15 months short of the legal maximum she could have given him, along with a $20,000 fine. She didn't hide how she felt about it either. She told him in court she couldn't understand how a college-educated man, who by his own account, grew up in one of the most loving households, could have done what he did. She reminded him directly that we can never ignore the damage you inflicted on those women and society at large. Sharper tried to address the court himself. His voice broke as he apologized, saying he'd said sorry 1,000 times to the women he abused and to his family and friends, adding that he'd lived his life, right, for 38 years and then took this path, claiming he was still trying to figure out why. But the sentencing hearing wasn't really about what Sharper had to say. It was about the women who'd waited years to say something back to him directly. One of them, one of the first to come forward, had waited 3 years for this exact moment. She told him he'd tried to give her and prosecutors the big middle finger because you thought we weren't capable of stopping you, and then told him flatly that you made the biggest mistake the night you chose me as your victim. She looked at a man who once had daughters admiring him in Green Bay locker rooms and told him, "I hope no one ever treats your daughter this way." The prosecutor in that courtroom didn't mince words about who Sharper actually was. Underneath the highlight reels, he told the judge directly, I don't think Mr. Sharper's really wrapped his head around the fact that he's a serial rapist, a phrase that stuck to Sharper's name for the rest of the case. Because the New Orleans sentence wasn't the only one. Sharper still had to face courts in Nevada, Arizona, and California for the rest of the cases tied to those 16 women. When the Los Angeles sentencing came around, covering 2 women he drugged at his hotel room after meeting them at that West Hollywood nightclub, the judge there hit him with another 20 years. This one to run alongside the New Orleans term rather than adding to it. One of those Los Angeles victims, identified only as Jane Doe 4, stood up in that courtroom and let go of years of restraint. She called him this disgusting low-life human and said she hoped he'd feel as worthless as he has made me feel. Another victim in that same case described the psychological wreckage of surviving him, saying her career fell apart afterward, that she lost her confidence, that she lived in fear, and that at one point she'd even considered suicide. She told him what it did to her identity, saying it's one thing to be a victim, but to be the victim that got lucky in some eyes is not easy to live with. When I think back to that night, I wonder what he could have done to me. That's not lucky. It's haunting. By the time all 4 states were finished with him, Sharper had been sentenced to a combined total that on paper looked enormous. 20 years here, 18 there, 20 more layered concurrently. But because most of the sentences ran together, rather than stacking on top of each other, his actual time behind bars landed at 18 years, with credit for time served going all the way back to his initial arrest. His release wasn't scheduled for decades away. It was scheduled for the tail end of the 2020s. And that's when the football world had to have its most uncomfortable conversation yet. Because right in the middle of all this, Sharper's name showed up, somewhere nobody expected to see it again. The Pro Football Hall of Fame nomination list. It happened because Hall of Fame rules only require one selector to submit a name, and one of them did the same year Sharper had already pleaded guilty and been sentenced to 18 years. The backlash was immediate, and it wasn't quiet. Fans on social media started organizing around the idea of boycotting the NFL entirely if he was ever actually inducted. A Hall of Fame spokesman had to publicly explain that the institution simply doesn't have a character clause in its bylaws, which meant, on paper, a serial rapist could technically remain in consideration, purely because of what he did on a football field. Regular fans outside the sports media world weighed in too. Advocates for sexual assault survivors pointed out that Sharper's continued presence on any Hall of Fame list sent a message about how little the sport valued the women he'd hurt. One advocate for a women's crisis center said his nomination showed the lack of respect for rape victims across our country all over again. The Saints organization made its own statement without saying a word. They physically tore down a banner bearing Sharper's image from the plaza outside their stadium. He was never seriously close to induction. The football writers who actually vote made that clear through their public statements. But the fact that his name could appear on a ballot at all, years after 18 women had described being drugged and violated by him, showed just how far the gap could stretch between what a man did on the field and how the sport's own rules treated what he did off it. Sharper spent years behind bars after that. He kept trying to fight the sentence itself, at one point pushing a federal judge in New Orleans to throw out his 18-year term entirely, arguing it should never have been that long. That effort failed. The judge rejected his bid to overturn it. Meanwhile, the men who'd been charged alongside him were finishing their own sentences and rebuilding, or trying to. Eric Nunez completed his sentence years back. Brandon Lisciardi, the former deputy who'd helped drug women and admitted to raping one of them himself, eventually finished his time too. And Louisiana's police licensing board made sure he'd never wear a badge again by permanently banning him from law enforcement work in the state. Sharper himself eventually moved out of federal prison and into a re-entry program, a halfway house, the kind of place where residents are expected to find work, and slowly transition back into normal life under supervision. It's a standard step near the end of a long federal sentence, and by the time it happened, his full release date had already been locked in for the final days of a coming December, years after his crimes first came to light, and roughly 2 decades after he'd stood on a football field with a Super Bowl trophy in his hands. He was never elected into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and the writers and selectors who actually control that vote made it plain, through their own words, that it was never going to happen, regardless of what the bylaws technically allowed. His college, William Mary, stripped him from its own Athletics Hall of Fame. The moment he pleaded guilty, A decision that institution didn't hesitate over, the way the NFL's own Hall did. What's left really is the contrast that defined this entire story from the start. A man who was genuinely one of the best safeties of his generation, a Super Bowl champion, a broadcaster trusted to break down the game on national TV every week, and underneath all of it, a pattern of drugging and violating women that stretched across 4 states and years of his life, hiding in plain sight because nobody wanted to believe a guy who seemed that likable, that respectful, that safe, could be capable of it. That's exactly what made his own teammates' reaction so heavy when the truth finally caught up to him. These weren't strangers piling on from a distance. These were men who'd shared locker rooms with him, who trusted him around their own families, who genuinely liked him, and every one of them ended up using words like disgusted, mind-boggling, one of the worst things in league history. Even the people whose entire job is to celebrate football greatness, the Hall of Fame selectors themselves, said flat out that voting for him would make them feel disgusting. And the women he hurt, the ones who stood in courtroom after courtroom across 4 states, finally able to look at him and say what they'd been holding in for years. They're the ones who put it in the plainest terms of all. Not a serial rapist who happened to be good at football. Just a man they hoped would spend the rest of his life understanding exactly what he took from them and never getting the chance to do it again.